Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And on the Influence Continuum, we've done a number of shows on the Jehovah's Witnesses, also known as Watchtower Society. They're a group that has millions of members worldwide. They are apocalyptic. They tell their people that Armageddon's coming at any moment. Very controversial for their pedophilia cover-ups and blood transfusion stuff. We're going to get into a lot of very interesting things today. My guest is a newly minted PhD doctor, Andre Jackson, who I am proud to say did his dissertation work on waking up. In fact, the title of his dissertation is Waking Up, a Narrative Inquiry into Deconversion Stories by Former Jehovah's Witnesses, Bethelites. Bethel is the headquarters, so it was very interesting, and I was honored to be asked by Andre to be on his dissertation committee as he was explaining brainwashing and mind control and wanting to analyze what causes people who are in this group at the headquarters level to wake up. But before we get into it, Andre, I want to give my listeners more backstory on you, if you don't mind. So you grew up as a witness in Germany. Your mom became a JW in 1987 when you were 7 years old. Your stepfather was not a JW while growing up, so your childhood was not as isolated as that of other JW children. Therefore, you were allowed to play sports, pursue hobbies, have non-JW friends, and go to college. So you were lucky that your stepfather. And the thing about the JWs is that men are the head of the household, so this was another factor working in your favor. You say you were a true believer even when you were in the hospital for a scheduled operation at the age of 10. You said, I don't want a blood transfusion. And fortunately, you didn't have to have one. But many people have died for no reason except that the leaders say God doesn't like blood transfusion, which wasn't even the original Russell's idea. This came from Rutherford, a later JW leader, but we won't get too diverted. And let's see, despite your authentic true belief, they often viewed you not as spiritual enough, and you were not even baptized until you were 31, which is another interesting thing, because I've met people who are baptized in their teens, like 10, 11, 12, 13, like crazy. Anyway, you traveled a lot, made many friends with JWs throughout the world. But once you started asking critical questions about the beliefs, many of the friendships came to an end. You started writing letters with these questions to the JW headquarters. We're finally invited to meet with two elders, two of the men in charge of the JW congregation that you had attended. And at the end of the meeting, one of the elders told you that he did not want to meet with you again to talk about the Bible. Guess you were like putting too many doubts in his head, is my prediction. And lastly, you finished your doctoral degree in business psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And so with that, I'll just add that you were never officially disfellowshipped, nor did you officially dissociate yourself intentionally, because your mom is still involved, right?
That's correct. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So I guess what I want to say, first of all, is for all the people who are born in cults where they're told the world's coming to an end, so don't go to school, get clean houses, develop, trade skills. I believe you're an inspiration and a role model to say, you know what? I was raised there, but it's doable. And in fact, you really did well, because I talked with your other faculty and they were very proud of you. and what you accomplished.
Thank you.
So with that aside, why don't you tell us about your dissertation, what you studied, what findings you found out, and any other messages you want to give to our listenership?
Of course. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. So, as you said, I did a narrative inquiry. So I looked into the narratives, how people tell their stories. And what I was curious about is waking up, which is a term that Jehovah's Witnesses often use to describe their realization that what they thought of was the truth, the religion, the cult that they're in, that it was not true, that they were deceived, manipulated, used. I was curious what that is for an individual, if everybody has the same understanding of what waking up is, and if it is the same process for everybody. Because some of the doubts I had when I shared them with my mother, for example, at the time, the responses to actions were so different. Not everybody reacts to the same news item or question the same way. And I was really curious, like, is there any similarity? And if so, what is it? So hence my focus on waking up. And I did focus on Jehovah's Witnesses, Bethelites, Jehovah's Witnesses who lived and worked at the Bethel compounds, not only the one in upstate New York, the world headquarters, but also in some of the other national Bethels, the national headquarters in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to focus on Bethelites because they're even more isolated. They live on this compound, so they're materially dependent on the organization. When they join Bethel, they need to pledge a vow of obedience and poverty. So it's really difficult for them to get away, which is something that the research bore out, listening to some of these stories. There's a higher degree of control. There's more monitoring, and they're materially dependent on the organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So living in this environment, I was curious, like, and yet it happens that people live in this environment, and something happens and triggers them to look into things and create doubts to the degree that they end up rejecting the organization and leave. So that's what I wanted to focus on. And something that was a little unusual about my research is that I leveraged existing interviews on YouTube.
Mm.
And it almost went the other way around. Like, I was aware of a lot of these interviews and a lot of this data being out there. And when I realized that this is something I could potentially use as data for my research, this opened up so many different avenues. Because as you can imagine, it's difficult to find enough ex-members of high control groups to get enough of a participant group to do research.
Sure.
So when I realized I could do that, this opened up this avenue, and I found 6 individuals that had told their stories. This information is freely available. Anybody could find this on YouTube. And those were individuals who were at Bethel when they woke up and then ended up rejecting the group and leaving. They're not all technically ex-members. Some of them faded, which is a term that is used to describe somebody who's just inactive. But they're not technically disassociated from the organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to comment, because a lot of people, their first contact with the witnesses is either knocks on the door or seeing people at bus stations or train stations nowadays. But they also pass out Awake magazine. So I can't help but notice that former members talk about waking up. It makes me smile to think about that. But I know when I got deprogrammed from the Moonies, I described it like waking up, like I was in a dark room. I thought I knew what reality was. The Venetian blinds opened, and it was like, there's a world out there. What have I been believing?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about some of these fascinating stories and what you did in your dissertation. And I will admit that you applied the bite model in your dissertation to help explain mind control. So that was interesting too.
The bite model is something that I use because it seems it is used a lot. Like when I'm on the internet and listen to other people's stories, it is mentioned a lot. And it's something that helped me like establish, as a matter of fact, that this is a high control group, a cult. When I read your book, I think like many others, I used a highlighter and I highlighted everything that was relevant to my situation, to the group that I was in. And I realized that I had entire sections of your book just highlighted in yellow. I'm like...
And you're describing combating cult mind control?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Just checking. Correct. And was it the German edition, the original German, or was it the English?
It was the English edition.
Yeah, because we updated it a lot, and I was curious which one that you read, because when the book first came out in '88, we had it in 10 different languages, so one of which was German.
Yeah, I had looked into different models, like, because when I had my first doubts, it was really, I just had questions. And it wasn't about the organization. I wasn't suspicious of anything. There were just certain things where I'm like, that's just not true. That's just factually not the case. And it sort of, it was the first sort of breach in a dam, like the first crack. And I allowed myself to be a little bit more critical and just pursue some of these questions a little bit more thoroughly. So when I would get answers, which were often copy-pasted from the organization's official material, to just like go one step further and see, was this true? And I came across so many instances where I'm like, that doesn't seem to be the case. The actual researcher that you're referencing here, turns out, is not a researcher. Or they didn't really say that. Turns out that Jerusalem was not destroyed when you said it was. And I accumulated more and more questions. And initially it was really all about the Bible. And then it was questions about God. And only then did I allow myself to ask questions about the organization and the leadership, which is really interesting. That was the last thing that I dared to question. When I realized, well, these misrepresentations in the material cannot be by chance. Like somebody left something out of a quote, somebody introduced something as an argument, referencing something else. And then when I look into the original material, I'm like, okay, somebody presented data in a deceptive way. And if that happens once or twice, you think, okay, maybe that's a mistake, maybe that's an accident, maybe somebody wasn't thorough. But at some point, it just became really difficult. And at the same time, I was listening to other people's stories, and they talked about Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult. And then I got curious, like, what is a cult? Because Jehovah's Witnesses sort of try to inoculate their members. They have a page on their FAQ where it says, are Jehovah's Witnesses a cult? And they say, no. And then they define what a cult is. And they're like, we don't meet our criteria, or the criteria we just presented, so we're not a cult. So I'm like, well, let me look into what actual scholars say about this topic.
Right.
And I found different models, and it looked bad, whichever one I wanted to use. But the bite model is really, I find, very intuitive. It's easy to remember the different, I guess, areas of control you can check. And so it's really easy to apply. And in addition to that, a lot of people are familiar with it and have used it. So I used that. The other thing I did in my research was to establish that, as a matter of fact, Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. Because oftentimes that is an assumption. It's not necessarily explored in a lot of detail. I know on your website there are articles that are on a sort of summary level. So I wanted to explore that a little bit further, and also leverage like concepts from business psychology. Things that we will talk about in class, like collective narcissism, propaganda, different areas of psychological control, where I'm like, as I was learning about these different tools, and I could just see how Jehovah's Witnesses use these tools. So I spent a good amount of real estate in my dissertation to break that down and highlight a plethora of different psychological concepts and how they're applicable in the context of Jehovah's Witnesses to establish, for one, what kind of group it is, and also provide some context. Because when we say somebody wakes up, somebody leaves, people who are not familiar with the cult phenomenon often say, well, just leave. Like, you're not chained. Why wouldn't you just leave?
Right.
Because they don't necessarily realize how difficult that is.
Right.
How much people have been controlled, influenced, and indoctrinated over decades sometimes. In addition to sometimes the very real material dependencies, like your family may not talk to you ever again if you say you have questions or you're critical or you leave. You may lose your job. You may lose your housing. So I wanted to provide some context to what is it these individuals went through. And then finally, the third bit of my background research was religious deconversion / waking up. Like, what could be models that are relevant and applicable here when people lose their faith? I was surprised to see that some research has been done in the space over the decades, and there's always slight nuances. But it wasn't necessarily clear if this would be applicable to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, because as a result of the difficulty to leave, there is a phenomenon among Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, that's called PMO, which is an acronym for physically in, mentally out. So those are people who don't believe anymore, but they find it so difficult to leave that they remain associated with the organization. So they're physically still in, but mentally, they're not believers anymore. Right. And that, for example, was something I didn't necessarily see reflected in some of the previous models. So that was sort of like the foundation I laid as I then started really doing the actual research.
Mm-hmm. Great. So tell my listeners who may not know, maybe they were in a different cult altogether and they may not have done a deep dive into understanding who the Jehovah's Witnesses are and what do they believe. Would you mind giving us, a summary of some of the things that make them distinct?
I can try. In terms of distinction, we'll have to see, because I've focused on witnesses a lot. So I'm aware of some other groups that have some similarities, but I wouldn't necessarily be the best to point out how they're different from other groups. But
I'll help you. No
okay,
problem.
Great. So Jehovah's Witnesses are a religious group. They are a millenarian fundamentalist Christian cult. They're restorationists. So they will often claim that they model their organization and the rules based on first century Christians. I'm just saying what they say. I don't know if we need to argue whether or not it's true.
I'm going to meta comment and just say that for me, they're not fundamentalist Christians, according to Walter Martin, who's a fundamentalist Christian theologian who wrote Kingdom of the Cults, because they don't follow the Bible, the King James Bible, or any scholarly translation. They have their own New World translation of the Bible. So he has a whole chapter on why they're not Christian, and he calls them cults because they're not following the Bible just on that level. And and for me, it's a really important distinction, because part of what I want, as you know, I want to update the law regarding undue influence, and I don't think we should be giving tax exemption status to organizations that are engaged in systematic deception and fraud when they're recruiting people. And so when they knock on your door, say they want to study the Bible, and they don't say, no biblical scholar was involved with the translation of the New World Translation. In fact, every Christian and Jewish scholar has said it's not accurate, which would then at least be giving informed consent to the people that trying to recruit. One ponders who would ever allow the JWs to continue if they heard that. We'll study a Bible with you that's our own making, right? But for me, the essence of legitimate religion has to be based on truth and on honesty and on a desire to follow out of faith and not out of coercion or deception. So that's my little rant to that
Yeah.
opening.
Yeah, very, very good point. I try to stay away from topics around dogma and beliefs in my dissertation. I wanted to focus on the organization and how they control their members. So I only touch on beliefs in as so far as it was used as a control mechanism. In my own journey, I consumed a lot of content where other Christian believers would engage with Jehovah's Witnesses or the material, and I realized how much there's going on. So I understand that point very well. But when I myself try and engage with witnesses, I try and stay away from that because it seems very, very difficult.
Well, talk to my listeners about what does Andre do when he's walking down the street and there's a couple of witnesses on the corner? Does he look at his watch and go, well, I have 5 minutes, I could say something? Or does he say, I think I'm just going to walk on by today because I have to focus on my work? Well, what goes on in your head? Because I often have those thoughts when I see witnesses, and I really do try to go out of my way, even to just say hello, introduce myself, give my name, mention that I was in the Moonies and I wrote combating, just to seed, the interaction, because people may be having doubts and they may interpret that as a spiritual message, that an answer to their prayers, that some dude who was in the Moonies just walked up to them and, handed them this card called freedom of mind. But what do you do? What's you have a mode?
I do like approaching witnesses and other believers too. And I try and be very open and friendly. I ask questions because with the witnesses, I do know that certain types of questions, certain approaches will result in them just shutting down. And sometimes, if they're in the public recruiting work, they will literally pick up their stuff and leave to avoid the conversation, the argument, as they would probably frame it. And like I said, I will try and stay away from dogma and from religious belief. I often ask them about the organization and how the organization is structured in terms of their leadership or their donations. The last conversations I had was really about the simple fact. My question was whether or not they're recruiting, which most witnesses will deny. They will say they're here to educate. It's a public service. But once I ran into witnesses who acknowledge, this is a recruiting effort, which is very obvious, I think, to most outsiders.
Sure.
And then, so I just had questions. I pointed out that I've gotten different answers from different witnesses, which I think may have value on its own because they view themselves as supremely unified, having all the exact same beliefs. What I haven't gotten to, but I think I would like to eventually, is to sort of help them realize that they're being deceptive. Like if I come and ask, are you trying to recruit? And you say you're not, but you are, right? To realize that if you're in the truth, if you are in a benevolent organization with good intentions and good effects for its members, why would you have to be deceptive when you recruit? Like the foundation right there is off.
Yep.
And what happened is he gave me a card. I went to the website and there are numerous articles about making disciples and progressive Bible studies and how to maybe stop the Bible study if they're not making progress towards baptism, and even videos of their leadership talking about this. And I sent it back to him. I'm like, is this not your website? Like, why would you tell me you're not recruiting? Like, you clearly are. Maybe you use a different term. You make disciples. But at the end of the day, you're trying to get additional members to join your organization.
Right.
And that's when he stopped. He never got back to me.
Yep. Yeah, and as I say, the goal from my point of view is empowering people to question, to
Mm,
think for themselves, and so not to win an argument, but just to
mm,
say, why don't you think about it?
mm.
Because you want to believe that you're not there to recruit, but in fact, the organization wants increase of members. They count members. They want to know. They want to promote people who are successful at bringing new people in. People who not successful at bringing new people in rarely get promotions.
It seems to be mostly around the effort.
Hmm.
Um, when witnesses bring new recruits in, that is often something people take great pride in. They believe they saved somebody's life or improve the likelihood somebody is going to survive the end of days, Armageddon. But it's really about the work, the effort, how much time you spent recruiting, how many
Right.
sacrifices. Did you give up your full-time job so you could spend more time in preaching? Did you decide to not have children so you could spend more time in preaching? Um,
I've
yeah,
met
I think
many women who didn't have kids and regretted it, left.
it's very, it's so sad
And bright
to,
women who wanted to go to college and wanted to go into grad school had
yeah,
scholarships even, and they were
yeah.
sat down and told, this is not what Jehovah wants for you.
Yeah, yeah. They take great pride in rejecting these offers like scholarships, academically or sports wise or musically inclined and gifted people. It's something Believing Witness will take great pride in and share with others that, they had this opportunity. Um, you know, I was friends with a young man in Spain who was offered to play for the football club of Barcelona, FC Barcelona, like probably in their youth cadre, but that is something that is such a unique and privileged offer. And he's like, nope, can't do it, you know? Um,
And when you say football in Spain, you mean soccer for the
Soccer,
rest of
yes,
us
yes, sir, yes.
Americans. When we say football, it's that other thing that is
That's right, that's right.
American.
Yeah, yeah.
But no, it's, I think you were very lucky to be able to have sports. I mean, I work with people who, just really, really, they were athletics and they just
Mm-hmm,
were not allowed to. And they weren't allowed to go into a church. They were, or
mm-hmm.
celebrate someone else's birthday, even a non-member.
Yeah,
They could get into a lot of trouble for sending a birthday card.
yeah,
Or celebrating Christmas is a big no-no in the
yeah,
witnesses. So
correct.
a
Yeah,
lot of what we call legalisms, things that the cult says, is biblical, but it's just human-made rules and regulations.
correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. So what is your hope for people listening to this? Maybe they're PMO. Maybe they're physically in, mentally out. What do you think about what's happening in the organization itself with world events? I know that the organization doesn't encourage people to vote. That
Mm-hmm,
doesn't want people to serve in the military and be part of society. And it's interesting because some ex-witnesses that I meet still haven't registered to vote
mm-hmm.
even though they're out. And I asked them, why not? And they don't
Yeah.
have a good answer other than inertia. Or I've been programmed for decades to think that it was evil and I didn't want to join the system.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
fact, it's a good thing to vote, especially when society is in danger of authoritarianism.
It's interesting how many of these things linger for so long, and often individuals are not aware of, ongoing reservations or biases they may have. In particular, I've noticed in terms of civil engagement, view towards other people who engage civically for social causes or politically, um, the celebration of things that they may have no emotional attachment or investment, no memories of. It's a little weird. Um, to now realize after you've woken up, or while you're waking up even, that you don't have a good reason to not do it. But since you didn't grow up in this environment, it seems very foreign. And you keep noticing all the things that certain celebrations were being criticized for. I still notice when people tell me about their Christmas shopping, I'm like, yeah, it's all materialistic. That's what it is. And it's almost takes conscious effort to realize how much joy people are getting out of these celebrations, or the benefit it has for people to take pride in their own achievement. That is something that I that I still struggle with.
Yeah, because you're supposed to be selfless, right? But now
Correct.
You're achieving something, and now you're a somebody.
Correct. And I think, if nothing else, if a child grows up and once a year celebrates their birthday, and I think it just results in a different mindset. And I can see, and I know from my own experience that even though cognitively you may have understood that, you were indoctrinated with certain beliefs that had no real foundation, you have no good reason for certain views, it lingers. Like my attitude towards LGBTQ plus, I was homophobic. I really was. And then at one point I realized that I have no good reason. And I've changed so much. I feel I'm so much more tolerant, and truly a better person. It's really curious, you know?
Yeah. I think about John Dehlin, who is a psychologist, and was sixth generation Mormon. He got excommunicated for speaking up for gay rights, because so many young people there were killing themselves, taking their own lives. And in his story of waking up, it was when he was in a business environment and some of his co-workers, he learned, were gay. But they were such nice people. And some were, in long-term committed relationships, gay relationships. I think it was maybe before there was gay marriage. But for him, this was earth-shaking, that to meet gay people and they're really normal and they're nice. And, this is extraordinary. And why does my church say it's so evil? When there've always been gay people throughout human history. So this was part of his, waking up. And I find many parallels between the LDS and the Mormons. And the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, plenty. Yeah, even gay animals, right? It's really interesting to, now when something comes up, something that I may not be aware of or familiar with, I just do a little research, and I sometimes on purpose expose myself to views that may not be what I want to be true or what I believe to be true.
Right.
To be able to employ critical thinking, something that as a witness, you are strongly discouraged from doing. Like, you're not supposed to touch information that is even being suspected of contradicting what you've been
spiritual pornography, right?
Yeah.
Why
Exactly.
a dog eating its own vomit? Why would a dog want to eat its own vomit? I mean, these really graphic metaphors that are put into little kids' brains over and over and over again, with repetition. And, for me, as I think for you, when you learn about the scientific method and you learn about scholarship, you are told to research the other points of view. In fact, before you write your paper, really understand the other side's arguments, summarize them in your paper, and then proceed to make your points and why you think your hypothesis is more reasonable or should be considered with greater weight than the others. And it's the complete opposite of an authoritarian mind control cult, where it's just trust us, we're closer to God than you. We therefore know better than you. So ignore your conscience, ignore your critical thinking. and just blindly follow. And when you're
Yeah.
a scientist, you're like, we don't have a truth with a capital T. We have hypotheses, and we pursue experiments to try to validate a hypothesis or nullify it or falsify it. And we just want to keep pursuing more and more accurate descriptions of what is real.
Yeah. Yeah. And being open to being wrong and changing your mind, which is really curious. I was reflecting the other day while I was waking up, a number of witnesses tried to help me with my questions and doubts. And usually this goes like to like a first level, like what I mentioned before, you get something copy pasted from the magazines.
Yeah.
And then the next level, that's usually when the support stops and you just need to believe. And often the argument that is being used is that you have your opinion, I have mine, and you will never change. And I'm like, but I've changed a lot. I mean, what are you talking about?
Right.
Clearly, I'm open to change.
Right.
I think
but that's threatening to them, right? Because they were just repeating that you're never going to change. But
yeah,
that's my recommendation to people interacting with Trump believers.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's a felon and has assaulted women and is a pathological liar, I just take the position of I'm willing to change my mind. Let's talk. Please convince me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Please help me understand how you understand what reality is. And please help me understand how you can trust somebody who has demonstrated they're all about themselves and that they'll change whatever they say for whatever audience.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe going back to the research that I did, that was really interesting because some of the things we just talked about were themes in these stories that I heard. For example, 2 of the participants were gay men, and they were both suicidal. Like, even as children, like, because the idea that there's something wrong with you, that you're so flawed, you're so imperfect, that you don't really deserve to even live, that really can do a number on people. And half my participants were suicidal at one point, which is something that I didn't expect. And obviously, I did not do a quantitative study, so this is not necessarily representative or an indication about the wider community.
Right.
But it's something I couldn't avoid noticing. Just the tremendous psychological impact that the belief system and the control has on people.
Sure. And it's a state categorically, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Moonies, Scientology are homophobic. They say that it's against nature, it's against God, blah, 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 and basically try to make it your fault if you have feelings that aren't aligned with what they say God wants you to have. And there's no room to be gay and a witness. They either try to brainwash you to get married and pretend that you're a heterosexual, right? Or you leave. And then if you leave and you have kids and you are married, they're going to shun you. They're going to disfellowship you and program the kids against you.
I think technically they would say you can just not live that life or enact your homosexuality. I think they do recognize that, and I think there's been a little bit of an acknowledgement that maybe it's not a lifestyle choice, but that's who people are. But even if it's so, there's nothing you can do about it, or you mustn't do it. So you'll just be single until the new system. It's not something that's discussed a whole lot. There's a few individuals where I suspect that may be the case, but it's just not something people talk about. So I don't know, how prevalent that is. If those individuals I have in mind, if they are actually gay or not. I know that I'm suspected of being gay, and then there's a lot of like things put on that is why I'm so hateful towards the organization, because there's a standard that I'm not
Sure.
willing to comply with. That was something that really stood out, that impact, which is sort of accentuating the degree of how people are manipulated and influenced to view themselves as not capable, not being good, not good enough. And there's a lot of rhetoric around that. And in some instances, it gets really crass, where the organization will say, we don't deserve to be alive, like I mentioned. This is all undeserved kindness. And a lot of the reminders the organization gives is about doing more. You never can do enough.
Right.
There's strong emphasis on works, and there's always, what else can you do? And that is also something that that appeared in my research. One of the individuals, he was just so exhausted, like he was already living at the compound, right? Like that was his life.
Right.
He was doing everything he could, and he was still being urged to do more. And he got to the point where he just couldn't.
Right.
It's like, this is, and that sort of led to a disaffection. There was like an emotional disengagement. And he was curious, like, what's going on? Why do I feel this way? And then started doing his research. That's one of the avenues. It doesn't seem to be the most frequent reason why people start having doubts and having questions, but it certainly can be the case. Just sheer exhaustion and a recognition that emotionally something isn't right. Like they don't feel the way they think they should be feeling, right? You're in this special place. You've been, I don't think they say chosen by God, but sometimes there is this notion that when they try and recruit people and they don't respond favorably, that's because God didn't draw them to the organization. So the mere fact that you are in the organization already, means something, because you're attached to this special group. And so it's about the group and what you can do for the group.
Yeah.
And don't take pride in your own accomplishments, your achievements. Even if it's something that is very evidently the result of somebody's own effort. Right. It's always thanks to God / the organization.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I'm remembering your dissertation, you cited one man who decided to get involved with Bethel because he had doubts and he wanted to be at the center of God's organization as a way of trying to resolve his feelings and such. Talk about that. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was a factor, because as a witness, the solution to most problems, if not all, is doing more for the organization. And the most you can do is be a Bethelite. I mean, there's maybe a few other avenues, but that is one, I guess, that's probably the most attainable, in particular for women and even for men. There's around 23,000 Bethelites. I think it's around 0.25% of all Jehovah's Witnesses live and work in these compounds. And it's extremely prestigious to be there. Right. There is an application process. There's a lot of scrutiny. You need to be recommended by the elders. You need to disclose a lot of things about yourself and your own past, sometimes quite intrusive. So to be then invited to serve at Bethel means a lot. And it is viewed as being closer to, I guess, the center, the core of the organization. You're closer to leadership.
Sure.
And on occasion, that is being viewed as maybe being a mechanism people can use to improve themselves.
Right.
So if there's these struggles you're going through and doing everything in your local congregation doesn't help you, maybe going to Bethel will.
Right.
I don't know if that's always the case, and I don't know if witnesses would describe it that way, but that certainly seems to be the case. That doing the more you can do, the better it is, and going to Bethel is one of the things where you can do the most.
Right. And if it's anything like my experience in the Moonies, the more contact I had with the top leadership, the less mystical it was, or the less I could just project and fantasize on what was going on when you're sitting in the leadership meeting with Moon, and you notice he hasn't cleaned his ear. You know, he has big, oily, greasy stuff in his ear, and of course you can't say anything. You know, by the way, here's a Q-tip, Father. You know, can't say anything like that. Or one time, bunch of us leaders were, standing up as he was leaving, and he just blew the most disgusting fart, and it was unquestionably noxious. But what do you do when you're with the sinless Messiah, the greatest man in history? And he didn't even apologize or say, excuse me, or try to wait till he got through the door. He just blew it right in front of us. And it was just, I couldn't think negative thoughts at the time, but after I got deprogrammed, then I was reviewing my experiences. There was an awful lot of things that were buried that actually helped me to get out and realize this is not what I wanted to believe it was.
Yeah. In my study, this is something that also frequently came up. It was not necessarily something that triggered people's waking up process, but looking back, they often realized it didn't help the exposure to the leadership. They often observed that those are just people. The processes here aren't anything special. They vote on certain things. They drink a lot. They drink too much.
I was going to say, don't they have an alcohol problem at the headquarters?
Bethel has a reputation for alcohol abuse and people drinking too much. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So also, like, I must disclose, I've never served at Bethel. I was not a Bethelite myself. So what I'm talking about is just, what I've heard, the accounts of people who were at Bethel. But yeah, some of them were very close to the leadership and observed just horrendous alcohol abuse. Like, I mean, using alcohol to make your porridge for breakfast. Like horrendous alcohol abuse.
Yeah, it's got to be hard to be a leader in such a misogynistic, homophobic, extremist cult group.
And handle a cognitive dissonance, I think. Probably they drown a lot of that. Or when they do things that they feel morally outraged about, but they feel compelled to do it anyways.
Right.
I think there's probably plenty of things people want to drink away.
Yep.
And in addition to the drinking, I was also just realizing, certainly in the facilities that I don't know how much material is still being printed. Like there's been a reduction over the years because now there's a lot of streaming content and the website is being promoted a lot.
Yeah,
but they still have
jw.org, I believe.
Correct, yeah. But they still have printeries, and like then for new Bethelites to show up at Bethel and realize, no, this is essentially just a factory,
Yeah.
And people will be people. Like one of the participants reported an instance of violence and being treated like in any other place, not even any other place, like being treated in a way that would have been bad in any other place. And it just sort of demystified the whole thing. And you realize that this is not led by God's Spirit, and God's Spirit is not involved in the decision making here.
Right.
In one case, it was the person observed an instance of, I guess, morally outrageous behavior at Bethel, and that person was promoted. And that's when you realize, well, clearly God is not involved here. This shouldn't have happened. So there's different ways where people start questioning and having doubts. The exposure to the leadership was usually something that was what I call managed. Where retrospectively, I'm like, this didn't help. There was something there, but it didn't make them pursue an investigation of whether or not they were actually in the truth or not.
Right. So what's your perception of the group now? Are they gaining members? Are they losing members? Are they expanding only outside of the US? What's your sense?
They seem to be growing at a slower rate than in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I attribute that to the internet. People who have access and just Google witnesses, or go to their Wikipedia article or go to YouTube, will quickly realize that's not a group they want to join. I think that's been a big problem. Recently, there have also just been real news, like things that make headlines in newspapers.
Yep.
In Pennsylvania, there's a case with a grand jury investigation about the cover-up of child sexual abuse, or the perpetration of child sexual abuse by various elders. There was something in the news in Norway recently, in New Zealand. So that certainly doesn't help.
Spain also had a major decision supporting ex-member group to say their freedom of speech about what they think of the group. That was a big win.
Yeah,
as well. So as we're wrapping up, any last thoughts? Any further recommendations if anyone's been listening and have been toying around with, I'm in this group, maybe not the Witnesses, maybe a different group. Any suggestions that you might have?
Based on the research that I've done, there are a few things that really stood out to me. One was that everybody had doubts. Everybody had questions, even if they were in these elevated, prestigious roles, being looked up to by everybody around them, their family members, their home congregations. Everybody had doubts and everybody questions, but they managed them. They sort of ignored them mostly, or they found explanations that they didn't pursue any further. That was something really interesting to me, because I expected them to be believers without any doubts. Which is interesting, like you said with your introduction about me. I was baptized really, really late in life, and I was often just under the impression I'm not good enough, I'm not spiritual enough, I don't do enough for the organization. I do suspect that it was really mostly about being outspoken about, certain things, rules, explanations, certain elements of dogma about, what is permissible, what's not, like referencing the Bible rather than the publications. And to realize that there's people who make it to these levels of the organization, but they still have doubts. They just don't talk about them. They don't bring them up. They don't share them. And I think that's a big problem that witnesses, and I suspect it's similar to members in other groups as well, since they don't share their doubts and their criticisms, they think it's just them, and they blame themselves.
Exactly.
And once you start doing research, you go to social media, you talk to others, and you realize, oh, I'm not alone. There's a lot of other people who have the exact same question. I mean, it is.
And about the same questions about other groups. They're not questioning the Watchtower. They're questioning the prophet of the LDS Church. But it's that same process. And I'll just want to rant for one more minute that I wrote the book The Cult of Trump, and I just hear media pundits constantly saying there's nothing you can say to a Trump follower. They're going to follow him no matter what. And I'm with you. I'm like, no, everybody has doubts. They're just suppressed. And we need to make more of an exit ramp to make it okay, to realize intelligent, educated people can be deceived and their minds indoctrinated into accepting all kinds of irrational, crazy, beliefs and following people who don't deserve to follow. And that's why I'm so excited always to feature former members who have not only got out, but doing something with their lives to really contribute. I interviewed a woman born in the Children of God cult, and she became a licensed psychologist and an
Mhm.
expert on disabilities, and another one who became an attorney. And for me, this is role modeling to everyone else who's in these groups. Hello, you're not alone. We've been there too, and there's
Mhm.
life after group. So, Waking Up, a narrative inquiry into deconversion stories by former Jehovah's Witness Bethelites. Andre Jackson, it's a pleasure. And
Thank you, Steve.
so, are we expecting what? Are you going to teach? Are you going to do research? What are your thoughts for your future?
Um, currently I'm thinking about just publishing an article or two, sharing some of my research, some of
Great.
these findings, like what I just talked about, I think is really useful. And to just recognize that if it is true, if it is the truth, it will hold up to scrutiny. You should not be afraid to ask questions
Yeah,
and probe. And if people get nasty when you do, that's more an indication that there's a problem, that you're actually in the truth, right?
exactly.
Um, and just maybe a last thing that I wanted to share about something that I came across when I looked at the themes in these stories of these ex-Bethelites, was sort of the how powerful, how meaningful it was for them to engage with their doubt. Like I said, they all had doubt most of the time. This was ignored. It was managed.
Right.
And a key element of everybody's journey was when they actually started looking into a particular doubt that they had. And
Yep.
sometimes it was sheer coincidence. They didn't know what they were doing. In one case, somebody asked Alexa, the Amazon assistant, just asked them to validate a date that is very important to witnesses. And the date that Alexa got back was like not what he expected. I'm like, oh, let me look into this. And it unraveled this whole thing, which is foundational to Jehovah's Witnesses' belief that they were chosen by Jesus in
That's
1919.
fascinating. That's a whole nother topic, of asking AI agents to answer
Mm-hmm.
your questions. I'm a little skeptical that it's going to be accurate and
Mm-hmm.
honest, but it's a very different world now with
Yeah.
information. When I got out of the Moonies, you had to go to the library and
Mm-hmm.
look in the Dewey Decimal System card catalog and see, under words, is there a book on this topic?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're suffering from overload of too much bad
Yeah.
information. And so
Yeah.
the developing ways to scrutinize, legitimate
Mm-hmm.
scholarship versus bogus scholarship is definitely in great need. So
Exactly.
so
I,
thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that exactly right. Like the ability to distinguish between what's misinformation, disinformation, what is true, it help people deploy critical thinking and have agency, right? Like, and that is the last thing I want to share about witnesses in my research is, it really seems that helping people to overcome this element of gaslighting, to like, no, you are smart enough, you can understand this. There's no spiritual component that is beyond your
Right.
capacity to understand. This is logic. This is history. These are numbers. This is
Right.
something that you can approach. Or if something seems morally outrageous about how something is handled, that these emotions may be valid.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's not that there's something so wrong with you that you feeling the cover up of child abuse. That's not a problem within you. That's a problem within your organization.
Exactly.
So for the listeners, if you engage, I think helping people to overcome this gaslighting, to help them recognize their capacity to understand and process information themselves.
Yep.
They don't need somebody to feed it to them. They can do that themselves. Or certainly it is okay for them to ask questions and push back and be critical,
Yeah.
to
For sure.
recognize their own emotions, that I think this can be very powerful helping people, because if you just confront them with data and say like, you're wrong, or like, did you know about this? People may just shut down.
Yeah, they typically do just shut down. So we're going to do a blog. We're going to put a link to your dissertation for those people who want to read it for themselves. And maybe it will spur on other psychology students and other people who have left different cults to say, you know, I can become a scholar and contribute to a body of knowledge about mind control and cults and how to get free.
Yeah.
So thank you again so much, Andre.
Thank you very much.
Have a
It
good
was
one.
my pleasure. Thank you. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.